Today's guest, Ben Lesser, was born in Krakow, Poland in 1928 into a family of 7. Ben was just 10 years old when the German army invaded Poland in 1939. Ben went on to survive 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He also endured a grueling 7-week death march covering approximately 284 miles. He also survived 2 death trains, one from Buchenwald to Dachau. Of the 3,000 inmates on that death train, Ben was one of only 18 who survived and is the last remaining survivor today. After so much suffering, he was liberated in Dachau in 1945. Ben and his older sister Lola would turn out to be the only remaining survivors out of his immediate family.
I'm holding on to my sister Goldie and my little brother Tuli, and we're just being pulled aside, never to see each other again.
Since 1995, Ben has dedicated his life to educating others about the horrors of the Holocaust and founded the Secure Holocaust Remembrance Foundation in 2009 to ensure the memory of those lost is never forgotten. Could you start by sharing a little about your background and what your life was like before the war?
Yes, Joe, of course. Yes, my friends, I come to you from an era in history where civilization lost its humanity, its heart. A time when there were only 3 kinds of people in the world. There were the killers, the victims, and the bystanders. We now know that the whole world knew what was happening to the Jewish people, but they chose to be silent, giving Hitler carte blanche to do with them anything he wished. And he did. 6 million of us, 1.5 million of whom were children, and the world was silent.
Could you maybe just walk us through your story, and when was the first time you heard about the Nazi threat and how did it affect your family?
Well, I didn't hear anything about the Nazis. The first time I remember, I was only 10 and a half. So the first time I heard about Nazis is when they marched into Poland, to Krakow, when I saw them. We lived in a 3-story building, and the whole building started to shake and rattle. So I ran to the window to see what's happening, and I saw tanks were rolling down the street. Following the tanks, there were half-tracks, and every few steps a soldier would jump out of the half-track, get on the sidewalk, and this is how they occupied the city. There was no fighting. Following them were the Wehrmacht with their shiny black boots and their goose steps. It was quite impressionable for a 10-and-a-half-year-old. And as soon as they passed the street, my father called us kids into the dining room, set us down on chairs, and said, "Okay, from this moment on, you are no more kids. You're adults. You're going to obey. You're going to listen. You're going to do exactly what you're told." And this is how we grew up overnight. 5 days after occupation, on the 5th day after occupation, a truck pulled up to the gate, and they started to bang. And the super came running out. What's going on? That was 5 a.m. in the morning, full of soldiers. And all they wanted to know is where the Jewish people lived. And he was quick to oblige. He showed our apartment, and he showed our neighbor's apartment. We were the only 2 Jewish families in a big 3-story building. They came breaking down the door and pistol whipping us. We were still in bed, In their hands, they had open sacks, and they were screaming, "Throw in all your valuables, money, gold, silver, anything they could find of value, throw in." And they were beating up my father to open up the safe. While my father's trying to open the safe, we hear this terrible screaming from our neighbor's apartment. My sister Lola and I ran out through the kitchen door to the yard and to their kitchen door, and we came in, and this is what we saw. This monster was holding the infant little boy by its legs. I didn't tell you, the mother gave birth 2 months earlier to an infant little boy. They had 2 other daughters, and the mother gave birth 2 months earlier. They were holding that infant little boy by its legs and swinging it, yelling to the parents, "Make him shut up." Of course, the parents were yelling, our baby, don't hurt our baby." With a smirk on his face, you can see he was enjoying what he was doing. He smashes the baby's head into the doorpost, killing it instantly. It's a sight that won't leave me. Every night I see that infant screaming in that sudden silence, what came out of his head. My God, what a memory. And this was only the 5th day. The other soldiers heard something was going on. They came running in and they pistol whipped us. They got us off him, and they were a little surprised to see what happened themselves. They said, "Okay, Hans, let's go." So they got together all the valuables. They threw it in a sack, and they threw the sack in the truck, and they took off. That was the 5th day. And after that, new ordinances started to coming in daily. Jewish people had to wear a Star of David from the age of 4 on up. There was a curfew from 7 to 7. After 7 at night, you couldn't be on the street. And we couldn't travel here, we couldn't eat there, new ordinances all over. And the strange thing is, for Jewish people, there were no prisons, no judges, no juries. If they found you disobeying any of these ordinances, the only punishment was to shoot you. And every morning you found dead bodies all over the street. This was going on for about over a year, when a new ordinance came in that the Jewish people may no longer reside in Krakow. They had, if you wanted to reside in Krakow, you had to go into the ghetto. They were making a ghetto. I hope you know what the ghetto is, Joe. Terrible place. My father was preparing to go into the ghetto. My father's whole family, numbering over 200, all went inside the ghetto. My father is packing to get ready when a young man walks up to him by the name of Michael Lieber. And he says, "Mr. Lesser, you know how I feel about your daughter Lola. I'm in love with her. Someday I'd love to marry her. But do me a favor, come to the same community that my family and I are moving to, called Nepolomice." My father, given the choice to go into the ghetto or to Niepołomice, he chose Niepołomice. And as we're leaving, of course, my father's businesses, I didn't tell you, was wine and syrup. He had the wine and syrup manufacturing. He also had a chocolate factory. He was the first one to make chocolate-covered wafers in Poland, something like Kit Kat, only in shape of little rabbits, bears, animals. Every time my father would come home, us kids would search his pockets, and he always made sure to have some goodies in there. Of course, both businesses were confiscated. And now that my father is packing to go to Niepołomice, we find out that he had 1,000 American dollars that he saved up for a rainy day. My father put the money, taped the money into a religious book between the pages, and he put it in a sack full of other books. And we're now leaving Krakow. An hour outside the city, we're being stopped. Halt! And two husky Nazis jump on the wagon. The first thing they wanted to know, do we have any Jewish literature, books? And they saw two sacks full of books. They picked them up and heaved it on the side of the road. They had a mountain full of books. After everybody passed the road, they were going to have a bonfire. My sister, Lola, spoke a beautiful German. So she walks up to him and she says, look, my father is a writer. He wrote his autobiography in one book. Let him keep this one book. You can imagine which book we meant. And he liked the way she spoke German, I guess. He says, okay, I'll give you 5 minutes if you can find it. The whole family is climbing on a mountain of books. They all look the same, black or brown, leather-bound. We keep sliding down. After 5 minutes, he chased us away. No book. You couldn't recognize my father. He's going to a new community without a penny. It's not like he can get a job. Jewish people are not allowed to be hired. Anyway, we arrived at this new community, a beautiful farmhouse that Michael rented half of it. The other half lived the apple orchard farmer, and one half was for us. Between the two apartments, there was a baking oven. People used to bake their own breads. When Michael, my future brother-in-law, heard what happened to my father, that all his money is gone, he brought him a sack full of flour, 100 pounds of flour, figuring he'll be able to bake bread to feed the family. When my father saw the flour, his face lit up. Instead of baking bread to feed the family, he started to bake pretzels. Why pretzels? All you need for pretzels is flour, water, and salt, and those ingredients he had. And then he took the pretzels to the neighboring bars and offered it for sale. It was a novelty. They started to buy his pretzels. And now my father became a little baker in that community in Niepołomice. I was 12 years old. I remember baking with my father. To this day, I still remember some of the recipes, and I bake when I get a chance. So this lasted for about a year, and Michael and Lola get married. They get married, and we had a big a big group of people coming to the wedding in the backyard, and you'll see the picture. Out of all those people in the yard, only 3 of us survived: Michael, Lola, and I. The rest of the family, and all the friends were all killed. Michael and Lola move in to a duplex. The owner of the duplex happened to be the mayor of Neapolomice. One night he comes home from work and he says, "Michael, Lola, save yourselves. I heard a rumor there's going to be a raid against the Jewish people tonight or tomorrow night." As soon as Michael heard that, he went out and he hired a wagon with a driver. In the middle of the night, we snuck out of Neapolomice. The only place we can go was a place called Bochnia. Bochnia was a mid-sized city. That meant we had to go inside the ghetto. They had a ghetto in Bochnia. Bochnia Ghetto had a very bad reputation. What happened? Every so often, 2 or 3 dump trucks would come into the ghetto, and Nazis would go from house to house, pull out the children from their beds, and throw them into these dump trucks. You can just imagine the parents were screaming for the children are screaming for the parents. And as they filled up those 2 or 3 dump trucks, the trucks would pull out of the ghetto, and the parents were running behind and screaming for their children. But these cultured people had machine guns at the end of each truck. And as the parents were running behind these trucks, they mowed down the parents in front of the children. That resonated throughout Europe. Stay away from Bochnia Ghetto because of these atrocities. But we had no choice. And it's a good thing we left Neapolomice, because that night there was a raid, and all the Jewish people were put in trucks, taken to the forest, and the men were given shovels to dig a ditch, and everyone was killed. Everyone was shot. How do we know this? Lola and I survived the war. We were the only 2 who survived. We went back to Neapolomice after the war to find out what happened to everybody. And the farmers were telling us, as they were going to the forest to pick mushrooms and berries to sell in the market, they saw those trucks pull in, and they were hiding behind trees. They said the ground was moving for 3 days afterwards. They didn't care if they killed you or they buried you alive. So it's a good thing we did go to Bochnia Ghetto. And in Ghetto, the driver unloads us in the middle of the street. And Michael sees his school buddy by the name of Farber. Farber was a Jewish policeman inside the ghetto. They had policemen. They didn't have any weapons. All they had was a baton on the side. And Farber says, Michael, Lola, what are you doing here? Michael tells him the story. Farber says, okay, don't worry, Michael. I'll find a place for you to live and for your parents. And anyway, he took them to one place. And he took my father, my mother, myself, my little brother, the four of us, to another room, one big room. There were 8 other people inside the room. So now we were 12. No beds. All they had was straw on the ground, blankets on top of the straw, blankets hanging from the ceiling, separating each family. Everybody inside the ghetto had to work. If you didn't work, you didn't receive any rations. You would die. I was about maybe 13 years old, and I remember my job. I worked in a uniform factory sewing on buttons on uniforms. It was easy work, but it was 12 hours a day, little sleep and little food. And that lasted a year and a half. And one day, Farber goes over to Michael and Lola, says, Michael, Lola, save yourselves. I heard a rumor there is going to be a raid tonight in the ghetto here. Well, ever since those trucks would move in to the ghetto and pull out the children from their beds, every apartment and every house had a hiding place. They called them bunkers. That's when we found out our bunker was this ornate piece of furniture where you hang your coats and your jackets. As you opened the door, you pushed the clothing apart, the back panel would slide apart, and there was a hole in the wall, and the 12 of us could crawl through the hole and stand in the wall between the two walls. The last one would have to close the door behind him, put the closing back in place, close the back panel, and we stood there all night shaking and shivering. You see, lucky for us, the outside on the street level, the houses were connected, but the roofs were open and it was snowing. It was cold. And we were shivering all night long. We heard shootings, dogs barking. We heard our neighbors screaming. They're being torn apart by these wild dogs. Towards morning, it got quiet. When it got quiet, we dared to come out. When we came out, we saw the closing were pushed aside to a side. The door was open. So apparently they looked inside the shop. We come outside, and we couldn't believe what our eyes are seeing. We saw our neighbors being torn apart by dogs laying in the snow, pieces of bodies laying in the snow, a mother with an infant torn apart, the babies torn apart, the mother was still breathing. And people are running and screaming. My God, it was pandemonium. And they were people in push carts going around and picking up these bodies and pieces of bodies, placing them in push carts and taking them to the ghetto square. on the ghetto square. They piled them up as high as they could. These cultured people would come with gasoline cans, pour gasoline over these bodies, and start a Bochnia Ghetto human bonfire in Ghetto Square. Do I have to tell you what it was like? It was... I can't describe it. It's like hell. Like being in hell, and the burning bodies, and people were screaming and running. I knew that Michael and Lola were hiding in the doghouse. You heard, right? The doghouse. You lift the floor up. There was a step ladder down there and room for 7 people to hide. 7 people could hide there. They had provisions and bedding. Michael is telling this story. As they were about to go into the doghouse, another Jewish policeman by the name of Morris Schiller walks up to him. He says, Michael, Lola, I know about your doghouse hiding place. Unless you take my mother and my sister along, I'm going to tell the authorities. Well, there was only room for 7, but now there were 9. So Michael and Lola decided to walk away so the other 7 could go in. While they were walking the street, Farbert, the friendly Jewish policeman, sees them. He says, Michael, Lola, why aren't you hiding someplace? So Michael tells him the story about Morris Schiller. When Farber hears that, he says, Michael, Lola, don't worry. Where my sister and her 2 children are hiding, there's room for you. Follow me. And he took them to a leather factory, a tannery. And above the tannery, they had a water tank. He says, my sister and her 2 children are inside that water tank. There's a step ladder you can walk up. Inside there's a rope. You're going to lower yourself. And then towards morning, if you hear my knock on the tank, that means the coast is clear. You can come out. Well, Michael is telling the story. They lower themselves into the water tank, and they see his sister is standing knee-deep in water. Her little girl is standing waist high in water, and the mother is holding an infant little boy asleep, and they're all shivering and shaking. Michael picks up the girl from the water, and Lola takes the baby from the mother, and they were all standing there and shivering all night long. They heard the same thing we heard, shootings, dogs barking, screaming all night long. Towards morning, it got quiet, and Farber gave that signal on the tank. It was time for them to come out, and they pulled themselves out. And once they came down the ladder, they got some circulation back into their legs. The first thing they wanted to know is to go to the doghouse and see what happened to Michael's family. They came to the doghouse, and this is what they saw. Every person was laying in the snow with a bullet hole in the middle of their head. Little Marika, his 7-year-old sister, is still holding on the dolls that Lola made her for her birthday. Everybody laying in the snow dead. Lola saw that. She started to scream. Michael stopped her. He says, they may still be burning bodies there. They may hear you. So with the quelched pride, they knew what they had to do. They had to go out and they found a rigged wheelbarrow. They put the family on the wheelbarrow and they pushed them into the cemetery inside the ghetto. They had a cemetery. Michael found a shovel, and Lola, with the bare hands, are opening up a grave, and they put in the family. When all of a sudden they see Morris Schiller. He says, it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't his fault, because his own mother and his own sister were also killed. However, he says, that grave where you put your family in, I want it for my mother and my sister. You're going to have to take your family out. Lola started to cry. And Michael says, Lola, he's got the power over us. They had to pull everybody out, put them back on the wheelbarrow, and they found another spot. And while they're doing this, burying the family, they hear a Jeep coming up the hill, and the Jeep stops at the cemetery gate, and two husky Nazis jump out, and they yell, Morris Schiller, Morris Schiller. He goes up to them, he says, yeah, well, here I am. They pulled out the revolver and they shot him. This is what they did to people who have seen too much. They didn't want to leave any witnesses, so they killed him. And while they're going down, traveling down the hill, Michael and Lola walking down the hill. Joe, to tell you the story, how we were able to get outside the ghetto and bring with us 55 people outside the ghetto. So it was 55 people, our family. We are now outside the ghetto. To tell you, this is a beautiful story. But you know what? I don't have the time to tell you that. It would take another 40 minutes. So all I can tell you is have your people read my book. My book tells the whole story, everything. So we were outside the ghetto, and Michael befriends a truck driver who was hauling coal, and he asked him if he would transform his truck into a double-decker, coal on top, and between the coal and the chassis, there is room to hide Jewish people, and he would take him to the border of Czechoslovakia and Poland, and we will have a smuggler waiting there. We'll pay him a lot of money if he's going to do that. And he agreed to do it. He agreed to do it, and he transformed his truck into double-decker, coal on top. Between the coal and the chassis, 10 of us, 10 Jewish people could hide between the coal and the chassis. The first 10 people went out. Michael and Lola went with 8 other people plus 2 from our family, and Michael and Lola went first because you couldn't always trust these drivers. They tell you that they're going to take you someplace, but they take you to the Gestapo, the SS, and they get paid the ransom money for turning in Jewish people trying to escape. So because we couldn't trust the driver, we made up a passcode. When the driver comes back with the right password, that means you can trust him. And sure enough, 2 days later, the truck comes back with the right password. Now it was time for another 10 people. 8 from one family and 2 from our family. My father and mother insisted that I and my little brother go next. So I remember going inside the truck like being entombed. Like sardines, we were laid out on our side, and the truck went out Bochnia. 2 hours outside the city of Bochnia, we hear halt, and we see through the cracks of the trucks soldiers with rifles. We said, we felt, somebody turned us in, they're going to kill us. And they're talking to the driver. We don't hear what they're saying to the driver. And then the truck started to move. We felt relieved. They're letting us go. When all of a sudden we see that on the step by the driver, there's a soldier with a rifle. And there are soldiers walking on top of the coal. And the coal dust filtering through. My little brother is about to sneeze, and I'm holding his nose and his mouth. 2 hours they were riding with us, and then the truck stopped. We were already saying our prayers, they're going to kill us. When suddenly we hear, Dankeschön, Dankeschön. They were just hitchhiking. Imagine talking about miracles. They had no idea there were 10 Jewish people under their feet for 2 hours. And we arrived that night to the forest. The driver unloads us, and he tells us to go into the forest about 300 yards. You'll see a tool shed. Inside the tool shed is the smuggler. He's waiting for you. And sure enough, we came into this tool shed. We see the smuggler, who happened to be a forest ranger. He also happened to be the smuggler for us. He was happy to see us, and he took us in the middle of the yard. It was about 2:30 a.m., and he told us to lay down on our stomach and look up. We lay down on our stomach, and we look up. We see soldiers are walking back and forth with rifles and dogs next to them. And we see barbed wire. He told us this is the border between Czechoslovakia and Poland. And be quiet, and at 3 a.m., the soldiers will go down with their dogs. They'll meet new soldiers. They'll have a little ceremony, and then the new soldiers would come up the hill to the border. Within those 5 or 10 minutes, you can cross the border if you're quiet. At 3 a.m., we saw the soldiers walking down the hill with their dogs. After they disappeared, we started to crawl our way up to the border. He picked up the barbed wire, and he told us to cross. He says, be careful, because at the end of the other side of the barbed wire, there's a big ravine. And unless you're careful, you're going to tumble. And if you tumble, it's all over. sit down at the edge of the mountain, hold hands, and slide down quietly. This is exactly what we did. We sat down at the edge of the mountain and we started to slide down. After a while, we hit a plateau. When we hit a plateau, I asked my little brother, "Are you okay?" He says, "Yes." When somebody taps me on my shoulder, I jump out of my skin. Who in the world in the middle of nowhere? He says, "Binish?" No one called me Binish except my immediate family. He says, "I'm your Uncle Belo, your mother's brother." "How did you know to meet me here in the middle of nowhere?" He says, "When Michael and Lola passed 2 days earlier, they contacted us and they told me exactly where you're going to come down the mountain. I waited for you and I'm going to help you cross the border from Czechoslovakia to Hungary." We had to cross another border. Too long of a story. Again, I'll tell you, just read my book. It's very interesting. And it's just, and after we're now in Budapest, how we crossed the border is too long of a story. But we're now.
How long did it take you to cross the border?
It took us a whole night to cross. The border. We had to. It wasn't simple. We had to go in like students going to a school. The guards have seen us, but we were wearing short pants and laughing and like we belonged there, okay? That's a whole story. But anyway, we arrived and we are now in Budapest. In Budapest, we meet Michael and Lola. They waited for us. We have a meal together. And my uncle takes us to the railroad station. We board the train, passenger train, going to Munkacs. Munkacs is where I have my sister waiting for me, my sister Goldie, my grandparents from my mother's side, my uncles, my cousins. Everybody was waiting there. We arrived in the morning. We had a beautiful reunion. And my uncle, who was a very rich man, he invited me and my little brother to stay in his house. He had a yardage goods store where he sold yardage for dresses and suits. Above the store was his house, and he invited us to stay in his house. Inside Hungary, life was going on like there was no war at all. People were going to weddings, to bar mitzvahs, to temples, and dancing, and it's like nothing ever happened in the world. I tell them what's happening in Poland. Most of them didn't believe it. But my family, who believed it, said, "Well, this will never happen in Hungary because Hungary is an ally of Germany. Why would Germany occupy a friendly country when they needed every soldier in the front fighting for their country?" And it didn't make sense. And we were waiting for my father and mother to come in the next transport on the coal truck. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Finally, somebody came across who knew what happened. And he tells us when my father and mother were about to go into the truck, the coal truck, a Polish farmers saw that, so they called the Gestapo because they got paid ransom. And they came and they pulled everybody out of the truck. They lined them up against the building, all 10 Jewish people, plus the driver, all 11, and they were all shot. So this is what happened to my father. They were all killed. My parents, my mother, my father. Now we are in Budapest, we're Munkac, and my uncle happened to be a rich man. He had the yardage goods store. And I told my uncle, I says, Uncle, if the Nazis ever come into Hungary, they'll confiscate everything you have. It would make sense if you could convert some of your valuables into diamonds so we can hide it on our body. And my uncle listened to me. And one day he comes home with boxes full of shoes, a pair of shoes for every member of the family. And he told us, knows that in the heels of the shoes there are diamonds. Use it only in a life-threatening situation. If you can save your life, use it. And he gave everybody a pair of shoes.
Why do you think he listened to you?
What?
Why do you think he took your advice?
I don't know why he listened to me. He believed me, what I said. He believes that everything will be taken away because we lived through it in Poland. And I am now in Hungary. And sure enough, a few months later, the Nazis, in March of 1944, the Nazis just marched into Hungary like they were invited guests. And they knew every Jewish person where they lived, their address, their businesses, their education, everything. How? They didn't have computers in those days. IBM had punch cards. And they would sell these punch cards to anyone who would pay the price. IBM doesn't deny it, but they say they had no idea what purpose they're going to use those punch cards. So they sold it to them. And this is what they told the Jewish people. Germany needs workers. You will all be relocated to Germany. Able-bodied men and women will be working. Children will be schooled. Older people will be cared for. Bring along all your valuables that you can carry, but leave everything else behind. Anyone found hiding will be shot on the spot. Everybody believed that. It made sense. Germany needed workers. So they came along carrying all their valuables, bundles and valises, and they marched us out to the railroad station. At the railroad station, they lined us up 82 cattle car. And while we're waiting to get in the cattle car, I see two men with a stretcher coming up to me and setting down the stretcher. There was a woman, black and blue. I take a good look. It's my sister, Goldie. Goldie, what happened to you? She says she tried to escape. She got as far as the railroad station. A Hungarian gendarme who went to school with her recognized her. He turned her into the SS. They beat her to a pulp. And now they're ordering us to go into these kettle cars, 82 kettle car. Well, everybody's bundles, it got so tight that if you wanted to sit down, somebody had to stand up. In the corner, there were 2 buckets of water. Once the water was gone, there were no sanitary facilities, no toilets. 80 people, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, no toilets. Can you imagine what it was like? People were using those buckets, and those buckets were overfilled, and they were overfilling as the railroad would move. The third night we arrived at a place called Auschwitz. Auschwitz was Auschwitz, Polish. The train didn't stop there, but it went on for a few hundred yards, and then it stopped in a yard, and we saw a sign that says, Arbeit macht frei, labor gives you freedom. That's the gate of Auschwitz. But we don't know about Auschwitz, and the train stood there for 2 hours, and then it started to move again. And it went for another 3 kilometers, and it stopped. And it stopped at a place called Birkenau. Birkenau was part of Auschwitz. Birkenau was where most of the killing was done in Birkenau. They opened the door on the trains. They opened the doors, and they were screaming in different languages. Leave all your belonging where it is. Don't pick anything up. Women and children to the right, men to the left. And the dogs were barking, and the Nazis were screaming, raus, raus, schnell. I am holding on to my sister Goldie and my little brother Thule, and we're just being pulled aside, never to see each other again. You see, they went directly to the gas chambers. Who knew? I was 15 and a half, and I could have gone with my sister, my little brother. I could be a child, but somehow I didn't. I was figuring if this is a labor camp, they want you to labor. And if you labor, they'll feed you better. That was my only reasoning. And I went with my uncle and my cousin. As an adult, I was only 15 and a half. And we're standing in line, and we see chimneys with smoke and ashes and flames shooting out, ashes just like snow. Every time you step, make a footprint in the ashes. Smells funny. The men were saying, oh, those must be smelting factories. We'll probably be working there. Who knew? Nobody knew what it was. And as I come forward, I see a man with a white frock and a white glove, like a doctor. And he's going like this, left, right, left, right, left, right. That was Dr. Mengele, the angel of death. He decided who should live, who should die, with a flick of a finger. I don't know that. I see a doctor. When I came close enough to him, I heard him ask a young man, Kannst du 5 kilometers laufen? Can you run 5 kilometers? Or would you rather go by truck? He said he would rather go by truck. He had a bad knee. Poor soul, not realizing that meant certain death. They sent him to the right. But I heard that and it didn't make sense to me. Why would he ask such a question? I can see the barracks are right here. I figured he's testing us to see if we're strong enough to work. So I tell my uncle, my cousin, whatever he asks you, tell him you can run, you're healthy, you can work. But let me go first because I spoke German. I go first. Remember, I'm 15 and a half. I stretch myself out, tiptoe. I salute him and I say, 18 Jahre alt, gesund und arbeitsfähig. I'm 18 years old, I'm healthy and I can work. He did ask me, kannst du 5 kilometers laufen? Can you run 5 kilometers? And I said, jawohl, yes. He sent me to the left. My uncle, my cousin followed. They also came to the left. That was another miracle. 15 and a half. I lied. Had he known I was 15 and a half, I would have gone to the right. I didn't know that, but I figured they want you to labor, and you know, if you're 18, you can work. I told him I can work. I'm healthy, I can work. Anyway, my uncle and cousin followed, and they took us to a big auditorium, something like a school auditorium. And they ordered us to get undressed, get out of your shoes, walk over to the line of barbers. They're going to cut your hair all over, and then go into the showers. Well, picture this. I'm getting undressed, but I have more shoes on, and beautiful black shoes with the diamonds in them. My uncle who gave me those shoes and his son, my cousin, got out of their shoes because they ordered us to get out. If you disobey an order, they shot you. I didn't want to let go of my shoes because I had the diamonds. So picture this, I'm naked and I walk up to the line of barbers. They cut my hair all over. They weren't exactly gentle the way they were cutting it. They didn't say anything about my black shoes. The guards are walking up and down and looking at us. It's like God blinded their eyes. They didn't say anything about my shoes. And I went into the showers with my shoes on. After we showered, they gave us the striped clothes and they gave us wooden shoes with canvas on top, wooden soles, canvas on top. I got into those shoes and I put my beautiful black shoes behind my armpits, and we're walking out under the jacket, and I'm walking out, and they take us to the barracks. At the barracks, the Stubenmeltester comes out, the man in charge of the barrack comes out, and he speaks to us in a broken German. And I can detect he's a Polish inmate. And he says, "Ha, you Hungarian Jews. You think you're here on vacation? Think again. You see those chimneys, those ashes, those flames shooting out of them? Those are your mothers, your fathers, your brothers, and your sisters. And if you don't behave, you'll wind up ashes." I couldn't believe my sister, my little brother, ashes. and they chased us inside the barrack. We took a bunk, our upper bunk, and we lay down and we fell asleep. An hour later, my cousin wakes me up. Ben, get up, get up, get up. He kicks me. I says, what? What's going on? He says, listen. And I hear a chanting or a crying or a screaming. I can't tell what's going on. Then he says, look, there was a board missing in the wall, and we see a flame shooting up. What is it? I says, I don't know, but I'll find out. So I walk over to the Stubenmeltester, to the man in charge of the barrack, and I speak to him in Polish. Przepraszam bardzo, excuse me, sir. Can you tell me what is going on here? He was so happy to hear somebody speak his language. He couldn't stop telling me what's going on in Auschwitz. Huh, you Hungarian Jews, he says, you know nothing. 3 months before Hungary was ever occupied by the Germans, we in Auschwitz knew it's going to happen because they made us dig ditches to have fiery pits for the influx of the Hungarian Jews. They knew the trains would come in so fast and furious, the crematoriums wouldn't able to handle all of the people. So they made us dig ditches. And I say, what is this screaming? Or he says, these are children, and people have dead and children alive being thrown into fiery pits. One barrack away from my barrack, there was the fiery pits. And day and night we hear the screams. But I didn't believe the Stubenmeltester, what he said. So I made a big mistake. I went out in the middle of, it was nighttime, behind my barrack, behind the other barrack, and I saw trucks, 3 trucks, and throwing in people. And I saw them throwing a girl with the skirt, screaming, throwing them into fiery pits. I couldn't believe what was I seeing, because I see that view all night long. Every night I can't get it out of my system. So I made a mistake. And he told me other things, what's happening in Auschwitz. I didn't even want to know. He says it takes a half an hour to kill a person in the gas chambers. But they didn't have a half hour. After 15 minutes, when they saw everybody was laying on the ground, they would open the door, air it out, and they would have the Sonderkommando come in, pull out everybody, cut their hair, pull out their gold teeth, check their body for hidden jewelry, and put them on gurneys, 5 on a gurney with a rope on them, send them to the crematorium on tracks. But this time they didn't have all that time. They couldn't wait that long. So after 15 minutes, instead of throwing them putting them on gurneys, they would throw them into trucks. And they put the children, live children, on top of these half-dead bodies in these trucks. And they would take them to the fiery pits. They had 3 fiery pits there. And trucks were constantly throwing in dead bodies because we heard the screams day and night, and we were there for 2 weeks. What we went through for 2 weeks, I can't begin to tell you. All I can tell you is that every morning we had to stand in an appel. They counted us naked, and they pulled out anybody that's too skinny to work. They pulled them out and sent them to the gas chambers. And everybody knew what exactly is going to happen. So you didn't know every morning whether you live another day or you don't. After 2 weeks, they put us in trucks and they took us to a labor camp called Durnhau. Durnhau was a rock quarry. As they dynamited the mountain, the boulders were coming down. It was our job with sledgehammers to break it down to small pieces and throw it into mining carts, run it down the hill to grinding machine. They made gravel out of it and push those carts back up. It was back-breaking work. I didn't think my uncle is going to survive that. So I bribed the kitchen chef with my diamonds and my shoes to give my uncle a job in the kitchen. He took my diamonds. He gave my uncle a job in the kitchen. It got easier on us because he could eat in the kitchen and then he would share his ration with his son and me. So it was a little easier, but they couldn't, they were, their pockets were searched every time they came out of the kitchen. One night, well, every night when we came back from work, we would line up in rows of 5. In the kitchen, help would have to come out too and also be counted. They would count us and then they would dismiss us and we would go for our ration and go into our barracks. One night we came home and they count, and the kitchen help comes out, they line up with us and they count us and they count us and they count us. And the commandant comes down with this Fräulein. He says, I'm going to teach these Schweinhund a lesson they'll never forget. I'm going to teach these pig dogs a lesson they'll never forget. What happened? 3 inmates escaped. And because of this, he orders his henchmen to pull out every 10th person in line to receive 25 lashes. As they're counting every 10th person, they pull them out. I can see my uncle who is in front of me is going to be at 10. So I push him behind me, and I took his place. I became at 10. And they took us in the middle of the yard. They brought down 1 by 1 hardwood stakes about 2.5 feet long. And they brought down a sawhorse. You know what a sawhorse is? You take 2 sawhorses and you put a log of wood to cut it. A sawhorse is like a tripod. It has 2 by 4 on top and it has 4 legs. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
Okay, a sawhorse. And this is what they order us to do. Tiptoe in front of the sawhorse. Bend over, but your stomach cannot touch the 2 by 4 on the sawhorse. Your heel cannot touch the ground. You have to tiptoe. One man was pulling your trousers real tight, while the other one starts to hit. And you have to count out loud. If you miscount it, you start from one again. If your heel touches the ground, you start from one again. If your stomach touches the 2x4, you start from one again. It was almost impossible. I was number 4. The first man goes up. He miscounted. He touched the ground. He touched 2x4. Finally, he falls. As he falls, the commandant goes over, kicks him in the face. Get up. He couldn't. He pulls out a revolver and he shoots him right in the temple. His girlfriend walks over to the commandant and gives him a hug and a kiss, like he just performed the heroic act. He killed a man. Number 2 goes up. The same way, he miscounted. He touched the heel. He touched the 2x4 again and again, and he falls. The commandant goes over, kicks him in the face. Get up. He couldn't. He pulls out the revolver and he shoots him. We have 2 dead bodies. The third man goes up. He was a little younger, and he too miscounted. He touched the 2x4. He touched the floor with the heel. Again and again, he yells out, "Please don't shoot me. Have mercy on me. Don't kill me." So the commandant says to him, "Then stand up, come over here and face me." The poor guy stands up, makes 4 steps, and his knees gave out. He falls. The commandant goes over, kicks him in the face. Get up. He couldn't. He shoots him. We have 3 dead bodies. Ben Lesser is next in line. All I remember, I walked up to that sawhorse, tiptoed, bent over, and I said to myself, Ben, if you want to live another 5-10 minutes, you better do exactly what you're told. I tiptoe, I bend over without touching the 2x4. One man is pulling my trousers, the other one starts to hit, and I start to count 1, 2, 3. And every time they hit me, I feel they're tearing my skin apart. The flesh is just being pulled apart. I don't know what happened to me. We talk about miracles. 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, I made it. You can hear a pin drop in the camp because nobody believed anyone could make it. The man who was holding my trousers, pulling my trousers tight, that tells me in Yiddish, go over and thank him. So I stand up, blood is running down my legs. I walk over to him, I salute him, and I say, Danke schön, Herr Kommandant. Thank you, Herr Kommandant. When he hears that, he puts his hand in my shirt collar and twists me around, facing the number 10s who are still to be beaten. When all of a sudden we hear a commotion at the gate. They caught those 3 inmates, and they were pulling them in, bloodied black and blue. You couldn't recognize any of them. They pulled them in. The minute the commandant saw that, just like a child gets sick of a toy and throws it away, he tells all of us number 10 to go back in our original line. And he orders his henchmen to bring down a portable gallows We all had to stand there and watch while they were hanging each one individually. The third man, they put the noose around him. He started to yell. He started to scream out a Hebrew prayer before dying. Shema Yisrael. And the minute they heard that, they kicked the stool out from under him. They wouldn't let him complete the last two words, God is one. They were such sadists. And then they dismissed us. We went for rations like nothing ever happened. For weeks, I could not lay on my back because of those welts that I had. I had to lay on my stomach. One night we hear cannon fire, like the front was closing in. That morning we report to go to work. There's a loudspeaker saying, nobody is going to work today. The camp is being evacuated. Line up in rows of 5 and march out. I'm holding on to my cousin, and my uncle was already in the kitchen. We couldn't say goodbye to him. We never saw him again. Never saw him again. And they started to march us. That was called the Death March. Because if you could not keep up with the soldiers when they're walking, they simply shot you. And all day you heard pop, 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 people are being shot. In my book, I say that we marched on the Death March 3 or 4 weeks. A German professor who read my book contacted my daughter. He said how much he loved my book, and he asked permission to change it to German, and we gave him permission. However, he says your father made 2 mistakes in his book. He says he's marching in the Death March 3 or 4 weeks. Your father marched 7 weeks in the Death March, 456 kilometers from Durnhau to Buchenwald. And he knows. And he knows. The second mistake I'll tell you a little later. But meanwhile, we are now arriving. I want you to know the last weeks on the Death March, my shoes fell apart. So I marched in the Death March barefooted for a week. To this day, I'm still suffering with my feet.
So every day, did you walk a certain amount of miles?
Yeah.
Or was it different every day?
Well, yes, but every day they kept shooting people who couldn't keep up with the pace of the soldier. They shot them. And here I had no more shoes, so I had to keep up pace with the soldiers. And my cousin begged me, he says, please let me sit down. Everyone will pass, they'll shoot me. I can't take it anymore. I wouldn't let him. I says, no, Isaac is his name. No, Isaac, you and I are both going to survive this. And I pulled him along, all along. And finally, after 7 weeks, I guess, 456 kilometers, we arrived to Buchenwald. They counted us, and they told us to go into the barrack. They're going to feed you. They're going to give you fresh clothes and fresh shoes, and you can shower there. But tomorrow morning, come back to the same spot because Buchenwald is also being evacuated. Next morning, after we ate and we got dressed, they counted us and we marched out. And 300 yards outside the camp, we see cattle cars waiting for us. So they line us up, 82 cattle car. I push my cousin up and I say, find a spot against the wall where we can rest our back against the wall. I remember going to Auschwitz and there were people all around me. It was terrible. And he did. He found a spot against the wall and he saved the spot for me. And they loaded the wagon, 82 cattle car, and they closed the door. 2 hours later, they opened up the door and they threw in 80 loaves of breads, a loaf of bread for every person. Picture this. Those people who were next to the door were grabbing 4 or 5 breads. Those of us against the wall had nothing. We don't know where we're going, for how long we're going. I need a bread. So I started to climb over the sitting inmates to get to the door and pull out the bread from somebody who had several of them. When one inmate had a pocket knife, he didn't like the fact that I was climbing on his head. He stabs me right in the middle of my throat, and I feel the blood is filling up my mouth. Can't stop. I have to get a bread. I climbed to the door and there was a man with 5 or 6 breads. I pulled one out and I put it in my pocket and I went back to my cousin. My cousin says, Ben, what's happening to you? You're bleeding. I put my finger here. It went right through my tongue. I have to this day, I still have a mark. But the mark is now over my chin bone because when I was skinny, it was in the middle of my throat. Now I filled up. It's over here on my chin bone. Talk about miracles. But
Why did he stab you?
because he didn't like I was climbing over his head. He didn't like that. I don't know. Everybody figured we're dying anyway. He enjoyed himself with the knife. He stabbed me. I imagine because he didn't like the fact that I was climbing over his head. And talk about miracles. With all that filth, I took a piece of my pants. I tore off a piece of pants. I put a tourniquet. With all that filth, I didn't get an infection. And I had this one bread, 1 week, 2 weeks. I rationed out the bread the size of half an egg every midnight when no one could see me, because if they thought I had bread, they would kill me for it. And it lasted for 2 weeks. That's a miracle too. How could one bread last for 2 weeks for 2 people? He only ate a piece the size of half an egg each night.
And what made you think to do that?
Well, we were supposed to have 2 breads, a bread for each person. And I only had 1, so I figured I better ration the one between the 2 of us. So it lasted 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the bread is gone. We were being shuttled around for another week. 3 weeks on this one bread and no water. Miracle. Everybody around me is dead. Everybody is dead. And we arrive at a place called Dachau. In Dachau, the train stopped, they opened up the gate, and they yelled, anyone who can walk out, walk out. So out of the 80 people in my cattle car, only 4 of us walked out. My cousin and I and 2 other people. The 76 people laying dead in the cattle car. And I remember there was a track on the floor, and the night before it rained, so there was water inside the track, a little water. We fell down on the track and we licked the water. My God, they chased us away. And they chased us into the barracks, into the camp. In the camp, we saw a mountain full of bodies. They ran out of coal to burn the bodies in the crematorium, so they piled them up as high as they could. And they put me, my cousin, and I in a barrack next to these bodies. No food. The inmates felt sorry for us. They gave us a little water. 1 day, 2 days. The third night, Befreiung, liberation, Americans, Americans. I tell my cousin, let's go out and see what's going on. And we hold each other, we go out, and we see the inmates are crawling on their hands and knees and kissing the boots of the American GI. They looked like gods to us. They liberated us. You know, when you watch the film, you see the camp inmates with the striped clothes jumping in happy that they're being liberated. Those were not Jewish people. The Jewish people barely crawled. I barely walked a few more steps. But, you know, when you see those pictures, people jumping, those were they were people who committed crimes. They were Gentile. They were all Gentile. And anyway, the Jewish people are crawling on their hands and knees and kissing. And 2 GIs walk up to me and to my cousin, and one of them had a can of Spam. He opened up the can of Spam and he handed it to me. It smelled so good. We made a mistake. We ate some of it. And both of us came down with dysentery. My cousin dies in my arm the night of liberation, and I talked to him. I wouldn't let him go. And they saw that they pulled him away. I followed. My knees gave out, and I fell. They pushed me against the wall. 2 hours later, a man walks up to me, nicely dressed. He speaks to me in a broken German. He asked me how many languages I speak. So I told him, and he hears Polish. I'm a Jesuit priest from Poland. I came here with nuns and with doctors from Paris, and we're opening up a field hospital, and I'll take you to the field hospital. He picked me up like a sack of bones. I may have weighed 30 or 40 pounds. I was 16 and a half years old. He takes me to an infirmary. the nun puts me on a cot with a white sheet, and she takes my vitals, and I pass out. 5 weeks later, I wake up in St. Tertullian in a monastery in Bavaria. It's a beautiful story. It's a story you have to know the whole story. And my story just begins, but I'm liberated. And now after liberation and from my whole family of 7, I found one more sister alive, Lola. And out of 3 billion people in the world, he winds up in the same room with me for 2 hours. And neither one of us knows that the other one is still alive. And I leave. And how I find out and how we met again, my God, it's something you have to read in my book.
So you were in a coma for 5 weeks?
5 weeks.
Do you know what caused you to go into a coma?
I passed out, I guess. I don't know. I was so weak. And I finally was liberated. You couldn't recognize me. I was a skeleton. I guess I passed out. I don't know. I passed out. And the way I came back to life and how I made a beautiful life for myself and my whole family right here in America, the land of, you know what, if I made a beautiful life, everybody else can. I was on Skid Row. I didn't have a dime for a cup of coffee. Skid Row on Main Street. And I was able to turn my life around and make a beautiful life for myself and my family. It's a story you have to read.
What was your experience of America when you first arrived?
Well, the first thing I saw was the New York harbor. The ship pulled into New York harbor, and we saw the skyscrapers. It made such an impression on me. I said, Ben, this is day 1 of your life. Don't ever forget your past. But from this day on, you're going to make a success in this beautiful country, America. I made that vow and I kept it. I kept it.
And that was 1947?
1947, I came to America, yes. In 1949, I left New York and Brooklyn, and I came to Los Angeles. And we wound up at Skid Row, my cousin and I. And then how we got out of this mess and made a beautiful life for ourselves. It's interesting. It's very interesting. If you're driven and you really will it, you work hard and you study hard, you can achieve anything in this wonderful country.
How did people react when you told them what you've been through when you got to America? Did they believe you?
Yes, of course. Yeah, but at the beginning, I didn't tell my story to anybody. For years, I didn't want my children to know that they're different than any other American kid. I made sure they went to public school mingled with all nationalities. They had friends of every nationality. It was years and years later, after my grandson in 5th grade called me. He says, "Papa," he says, "my teacher heard you're a survivor. Would you mind telling us your story?" And I went to his class. 5th grade. What do you tell kids in 5th grade? They gave me 1 hour to speak from 10 to 11. I spoke from 10 to 11, from 11 to 12. The school bell rang for lunch, and nobody budged. When finally the teacher chased us out for lunch, in the hallway they surrounded me with questions. I knew from this day on I had to tell the story. The world had to know what was happening, what happened.
The longest you went without water, did you say that was 3 weeks?
What, 3 weeks of what?
No water.
No butter. At the beginning, one guard felt sorry for us. He let us fill up the buckets with snow. So we ate some snow for about the first week. And then afterwards, nothing.
Was there any Nazis that were nice towards anyone? Like they didn't wanna be there or wanna be involved in all of that?
Very few, but there was one, in my case, that's when we were outside, when we left the ghetto from Bochnia, that part of the story involves the head of Gestapo. He is the one who helped us, but he was eventually found out, and they executed him. His name was Schomburg. They executed him. Anyway, it's an interesting, very interesting story, but very, very seldom that you find a Nazi helping. Most of them didn't.
When they gave you your number, I guess that's kinda like your new human identity. Did that come, like, on a wooden disc?
Yeah, right. This was my number. You see it here? I'm sorry. Right,
I see it, yeah.
right there. Yeah. 41212. Well, they didn't have time to tattoo uh, uh, because the Hungarian Jews were coming in fast and furious, train after train. So they made these discs instead of tattooing. Tattooing takes too long. They didn't have time for that.
Josef Mengele, he's probably one of the most popular Nazis from that time period. And I'm assuming he fled to Argentina. What is your thought on Hitler fleeing to Argentina, that theory?
It's a possibility. I can't believe that he took his life and no one really saw it. All they saw is ashes. I mean, who knows? It's possible he fled. I mean, he had all the money he needed, and for money you can do anything. You know, why he could have changed his his looks on his face. You know, for money, he can do all these things. He could have prepared himself and just instructed someone to make a fire and kill two people and says it was him.
It says that the bread was made of sawdust and they also served fake coffee. And then sometimes the food was contained with pieces of shoe leather. Was that true?
But true, very true, yeah. I remember one man in my camp got the soup and he found a rat in it. Cooked rat in the soup. You know, why am I doing what I'm doing today? First of all, I believe God saved me so many times. It's unbelievable. And there must be a reason why he saved me. And I think the reason is that he wanted me to tell the story. Not everybody could talk about it. It's important for the world to know what happened. What happened?
What is the most important lesson you want people to take away from your story?
Most important lesson is to stop the hatred. You see, Hitler and the Nazis did not start with killing. It all started with hate. Hate, propaganda, this is how it began. Well, we're all God's creation. We all have a right to the same right to exist in this world. The hatred has to stop. That's all it is. Whether there are Nazis out there today, they hate. Why do they hate the Jew? In the Middle East also they hate. They hate all over. Some of them, the hatred will eventually consume the hater. It will eventually consume him.
As time passes and fewer survivors are able to share their stories, how do you think we can ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust continue to be passed down to future generations?
I can't be sure. No. This is why I started the Zahor Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. And even after I am gone, my foundation is going to continue. My daughters and granddaughters promise to continue the Zahor Foundation for generations to come. I made sure of it. Because I feel God gave me the years to make sure I can tell this story. It should not die with me. It will continue. It will continue for a long time. And I hope that most schools are going to teach it. I was successful here in Nevada. This year is the first year they're teaching about the Holocaust. Not just the Holocaust. They didn't teach about other nationalities. They didn't teach about the Indians, or they just didn't teach any of this. But they're teaching it this year, and there's still a few states in the states of America that don't teach the Holocaust. And we're working on it. The Holocaust should be taught. Everything should be taught. History is history. You don't delete any part because you don't like to.
You talked about how you have nightmares constantly about this. Does that happen like every night?
I would say almost every night. Not every night, but almost every night. I have a hard time falling asleep because when I lay in bed, memories come back. And those keep me awake. And one memory leads to another memory and another memory, and it then becomes a nightmare. I can't describe it. All I could tell you is there are nights that I wake up in the middle of the night screaming.
Your father's chocolate factory, is that still standing today, or is that still like in operation?
What factory?
The chocolate factory, your father's businesses?
You know, it's still there. Pishinger Chocolate Factory is still there in Krakow, Poland. We were there recently. We bought a whole bunch of it, brought it back. Of course, we have no interest in it. They took it away from us. It belongs to who knows who. I don't know.
Was that your father's passion, was cooking?
Yes. He also had a wine and syrup manufacturing. So he had two. And after everything was taken away from him during the war, he had to make a living. So I don't know how he took that. He started to bake. In Jeppalomitze, how did he know how to bake mandelbread and all kind of things? Now, Sawhorse Foundation needed money to continue. So I called in the kids and I said, what did my father do when he needed money? He started to bake. So I started to bake mandelbread. It's a certain cookie, which from memory, I was 12 years old. I used to bake with him. And it took a couple weeks for me to, every day I baked till I finally come out with the mandelbread that the closest to what my father used to make. We even started the business to sell mandelbread, and it was selling like crazy, but we were losing money. We just couldn't manufacture it. It's a labor-intensive job, and you need a bakery that's automated, and we didn't have that. We made a mistake. So someday maybe my kids will go back to it, to big automated factory, if they knew one, if they get to know one. Unless you know one, you can tell us. I am working now to give brochures, 60 pages, a little book for every high school kids in Germany. And I'm already doing it in Bavaria. And this is why I got this award from Germany.
The red one?
Yeah.
What is the award?
That's the highest award that they give to any civilian. And they gave it for Sawhorse Foundation, reminding the world there was a Holocaust. Don't forget. Sawhorse means remember.
Like, how do you think this even all started? Is it just hating people for no reason? Is it just propaganda that people believed? And
Well, it started in Germany. It started with hate because Hitler needed a scapegoat. So he chose the Jewish people as a scapegoat for his problems. That's how it started. The German people were not born monsters. Hitler, the hatred that he spewed in there, changed them to become monsters. I think it's close to 7,000 people were in that death train, and out of the 7,000, when we arrived into Dachau, only 18 walked out alive. And I am the last survivor today from that death train. No, not. Well, it's possible. I doubt it. Hidden children, yes, but not newborn. Maybe some were newborn. It's possible that mother gave birth to a child and she happened to know a Gentile willing to hide the child like their own or something like that. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, the children survivors that are alive today, they're still survivors. So they speak, but they tell their story, but they don't have the full story about the camps because they were never in camps. So this is why I don't know how many true survivors there's still around. Because these children survivors who were hidden are also called survivors. You understand? So there's a difference between the two type of survivors. One of them went through the camps and the death marches and all that. The others were hidden children by Gentiles. But they survived. So they're a survivor. While individuals can't always choose what happens to them, but whether it's a crisis or a calamity, people can choose to either let it ruin their lives or to learn from it and move forward. It's essential to understand the consequences of personal choices. It's possible to let tragedy or trauma become a reason to stop living. But it's also possible to live through extreme circumstances and commit to a life that has meaning, a life that matters. Thank you, Joe.